get that feeling when you're getting ready to upload your piece of art to the internet and you wonder, who's judging you? Who's staring at you? Who's watching you? Are you good enough? Any of those weird feelings? That's what we're going to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about my best friend, Mr. Imposter Syndrome. Hi everyone, my name's Matt, Cryptic if you prefer, and today we have another video that's a little bit more of a departure from my standard content, but good stuff to have and good information for anyone who is struggling as a 3D artist to kind of feel like they belong in the space. So we're going to talk about some of the key things that I think can kind of help overcome imposter syndrome, as well as things you can do to kind of try to avoid it or work on making yourself a little bit more thick-skinned towards it. But with all that said, if you haven't yet, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. There's lots of good stuff here, especially if you're looking to learn 3D. And if you'd like to support me further in what I'm doing, you can join me on Patreon. We can get something free every single month, whether it's a model, a script I use, or new stuff that hasn't been released, on top of getting a video producer credit in all of my videos. So with all that said, let's go ahead and jump into this one. Okay, so let's get into the meat of this. So what is imposter syndrome? How do we experience it? How does everyone kind of deal with it and work through it? There's so much information on it, and I wanted to do a video based on my experiences with it, because boy, do I experience it. I think anyone who kind of gets into the artistic space, whether you're doing traditional art, 3D art, or any other form of art, you're gonna at some point feel this, and it's just not something that can easily be avoided. So we need to look at this and say, okay, cool, so what kind of tactics can we do to get past this? Because I don't think, personally myself, that imposter syndrome ever goes away. I do think it's kind of there to stay. No matter if it's you hopping to a new job or you starting a new piece of art in a new niche or anything like that, I don't think it actually disappears. Because quite frankly, I haven't had it disappear. I know a lot of people who also haven't had it disappear, and they're much higher up in the world of art than I am. So I think really I wanted to just kind of talk about it and talk about the things that I do myself to kind of get over it, or at least push past it, because sometimes you don't get over it. Sometimes it is there. So what is it, right? Imposter syndrome is where you have this feeling of less than. You feel like your quality of work or your level of work doesn't exactly hit where others do. Again, this kind of follows the line of like art is subjective. So like your art is good to a certain group of people, whereas someone else's art is good to another group of people. And so really we have to look at that feeling and just decide like, okay, so why do I feel this way? What am I doing that's making me feel this way, or what is it? I have a really good example of myself, right? So like I'll be working on a really big project, and then someone will post something similar or within the same realm of like project. I try very hard not to compare myself to other people, because I've talked about that before. I've talked about that in other videos. It's so damaging to do that. But when you see something that is so similar to what you're working on, you're like, oh my God, I don't think mine's gonna look like that. I don't think mine's gonna be any good. And you just start kind of like tearing yourself down. That is kind of where imposter syndrome lies, where it rests. And so how do we deal with that? Like, how do we deal with that feeling of like less than? It can be really hard in today's day and age to not deal with it and to, experience it more and more every single day, because we're constantly bombarded by people just pushing work out and pushing stuff out and creating amazing pieces. And it's difficult. As artists, it's hard for us to see all of this success when maybe we're going a little bit slower. Maybe you're not as like high detailed as somebody else, or maybe you're still learning the basics of certain things. When it comes down to it, imposter syndrome can kind of manifest from any one of these situations, whether it's a feeling of less than compared to another artist, or a feeling of not having enough experience compared to another artist or a group of artists or anything like that. And this is tough because that feeling, again, doesn't necessarily go away. There's probably always going to be a point in your life, unless you become some God-level master of all, there's always going to be some form of imposter syndrome. So I think that kind of leads into the first thing that I try to tell myself every single time I'm feeling this way. And, by the way, this doesn't always work. Sometimes you do have to just kind of sit in these feelings and let them enter and let them leave. I have my tools that I use to just kind of try to avoid that feeling, but again, it does just come and go. So the first thing that I always try to do is remind myself, I'm in a different spot, but that doesn't mean I'm not good enough. That doesn't mean my art isn't good. So you have to take a step back and realize that it's okay that you are at a different level than other artists, because the reality is that everyone starts somewhere. Everybody goes and grows at different rates. Reminding yourself that you are at a different level, and maybe you want to be at the level of that person, or maybe you want to not feel like you are less than compared to them. The reality is that, especially if you're just getting started, it's going to take time. You're going to need to work towards that, but comparing yourself early on is going to do nothing but damage. So that's something that I really try to do, is make sure that when I see something that really blows me out of the water and I'm like, oh my God, I wish I could make something like that, I try to take a step back and realize, like, I haven't been doing this professionally long enough. I haven't learned what they learned. I haven't done that stuff. And that's okay. I can learn that stuff. In fact, one of the things I usually like to do, if I see a project that maybe integrated something into it that I haven't done before, I'll write that down in a notebook and I'll say, okay, I'd like to play with this. I'd like to practice this and see if I could get to that same level. And if not, figure out how I can learn how to get to that level. The beautiful thing about art and creativity is that we are always learning. We're never stopping. So if you get to a point where you've stopped learning and you think that you're just good, you're probably wrong. You should keep learning. You should always be trying new techniques. You should always be trying to find ways to make your work either faster, cleaner, maybe work on things that you haven't worked on before, or try something new altogether. You should never stop learning creatively. So that's really important to realize when you're talking about situations like this. You always want to remind yourself that you are still learning, and it doesn't matter if you are where they are. The next thing that's really important when you're starting to feel imposter syndrome is to sit down and think about why you're feeling it. What is it about that piece of work or that artist that made you feel that way? Was it a direct thing, or was it something that you formulated in your mind? A lot of us will do this and we'll formulate it in our mind that will just kind of feel like, we don't belong because they're better than us. And the reality is that, you have to remember that artist does not know, nor do they probably care that you are feeling that way. Because the reality is they are in their own space, they're doing their own thing, and they don't have to worry about that. So for us, we're in this moment where we're thinking like, oh my God, they're judging me, they're blah, blah, they're thinking about me, they're making fun of my work. They're not. 9 out of 10 times, they are not. And so that's really important to remind yourself, is that when you see something that is of higher quality or anything like that, or something that you're comparing yourself to, 9 out of 10 times, they're not thinking about what you're doing. So you can take that feeling of being judged and throw it out. That's a little bit different for like the general public, right? So if we post our work, our art to Instagram or Blue Sky or whatever, and you get judgment from those apps, that is kind of like secondary judgment, right? And so you can take it how you want to take it. Generally, what I'll do is I will actually hide the comments because I don't want to see them. I don't care to. If I didn't ask for that kind of like judgment, don't care to, because all that does is just kind of feed into that feeling of imposter syndrome, like, oh my God, now the public's judging me. So I'll just generally hide them. You do generate feelings over that, and that's okay to have those, but just remember, like, this is the public. Everyone has an opinion. Keep in mind that depending on what you're choosing to do and whatever's developing those feelings, just realize how you can kind of subsidize them and get rid of them. Because the reality is that if you are doing what I do, which is posting my stuff to the internet, you are opening yourself to that critique, whether it's warranted or not. And so that can drive the feeling of imposter syndrome, especially if you release a piece that kind of gets you, reamed. I released a piece a couple months ago, which I didn't spend a lot of time on it. I was more interested in just kind of modeling and playing with new concepts. And so I released a speaker, and boy, did I get torn apart by the internet. But I don't care, because the reality is like, I know where my level of work is, and I know that I'm confident in what I can do. So that's kind of the big culmination of this one, is be confident in what you're doing. It's okay to make bad art. I've said it before, I've said it 100 times, and I'll continue saying it. It's okay to make bad art. Don't allow the public or feelings of you not belonging get in the way of that. Be steadfast in what you're doing. Post your work, and if you get a bad comment here and there, throw it away. That's okay. But don't think that you're posting something and something else you saw that was completely unrelated is somehow affecting you and judging you. That's really important. Remember, most of us don't care to look at other people's stuff and judge them on our own time. Because the reality is most of us are focused on building the next piece, doing the next, whatever, content, whatever it may be, the next something. Most of us are too much locked in that state to go and look at somebody else's art and say, oh my God, this is terrible. Like, I don't care to do that. Most artists I know don't care to do that. And they're definitely not going to do it publicly. So don't worry about that. That's something that we kind of, as artists, generate in our mind as something that people do. And it's just not the case. So we've kind of covered like how we get into this space of like how we're feeling this imposter syndrome, right? This can be anywhere from you comparing your art to others or you just feeling like you don't belong in the space. One of the reasons that I feel it all of the time is because I post educational content on subjects that I have never technically professionally worked with. Even though I know where my skill level is and I know what I know and I know what my knowledge level is, I've never technically professionally worked in any of these industries. A lot of that is by choice, but in the end, one of the main reasons that I end up feeling that way or feeling that, imposter syndrome is because I am posting this content to what I like to call a lake of other people who are much more qualified. I say lake because ocean, a little bit too large for the 3D creator space because it's still pretty small on the internet. But the reality is I'm throwing all this stuff out here and I'm wondering if I'm being judged for doing something wrong, doing something incorrectly, when really like the reality is like there are hundreds of ways to accomplish what we do. And so I'm just kind of voicing like my way of doing it. But that's one of the main things that causes me like the most problems when it comes to imposter syndrome is just wondering like, am I being judged for the content that I create, even though I have so many people tell me how much it helps them. So this is where I like to remind myself, like when I'm feeling like I don't belong in a space, I have to look at the general response that I get. Most of the time, in fact, basically all of the time, I've never received a negative response from another artist. And that's a good thing. That's a good place to be. I've received negative responses from people who probably shouldn't be giving negative responses, but the reality is those don't tend to matter to me. But like, how do you feel like you belong in a space, right? How do you feel like you are good enough to post in a space like 3D art or any one of these communities? The trick to that is you do belong, regardless. It doesn't matter. So if you are making 3D art, whether you're making stick figures move or you're, designing your first organic sculpt and it looks awful, like whatever it is, you still belong in that space. It doesn't matter. So this is where you have to remind yourself that even though you're not the best, even though you just got started, like whatever it is, whatever that bottleneck is for you, you still belong in that space, no matter what. I have to remind myself often that even though I don't work in any of these industries, I still belong in this space because I share my knowledge and I do the work that I do to match what they do in the industry without being there. And sure, maybe I do things incorrectly. That's okay. If I ever do move on into the industry and work in that industry, I'll be able to bring that subset of knowledge back to what I do here. But for now, I share what I know and I share what I learned throughout the years. And that's what's important. That's why I belong in this space. And that's why you belong in this space. If you open Blender or you open Maya, whatever it is, and you create something and you're excited to post it, do it. Realize that the judgment you'll get usually is from people who don't matter. And those people who do matter will either celebrate you or give you ideas on how to take your next project to the next level. But be open to that. Be open to the idea that you do belong in your space because it is your space. It's not, no one person owns this space, and that's what's so great about it. Art is an open thing. Nobody owns it. Nobody runs it. There isn't some big director in the sky that's running art. Like, that's not how it works. So just remember, like, this space is your space regardless of what your feelings are about other people judging you. And that when you're feeling like you're an imposter for posting in that space, you're not. And I don't think a lot of people understand it that way. It actually took my wife kind of telling me that and explaining that to me for me to finally like have that like click in my mind. So it's one of those things that like you do have to sit back and remind yourself. And if this is something you have to write down just to read when you're feeling this way, do it. Why not? So the next bigger question is when do you stop feeling like an imposter? I don't think you ever do. I've talked to people who have worked at multiple companies and moved to new companies, and they're like, oh, nope, there it is again. There's the imposter syndrome. Because like, if you are moving into new spaces, and you'll be doing this throughout your entire life. You'll be moving into new spaces as an artist. And every single time you do, there will be somebody who's better than you. Please keep in mind, generally, most of the time those people are not judging you. Most of the time they're probably happy you're there because you're there to help them. So when it comes to feeling that way, it never really goes away. So whether you're posting a new piece of art that you've been working on for a while and you tried new concepts on, and you feel like you're an imposter for posting something like that because you don't deserve to be posting something like that, the feeling never goes away. It's really going to come down to how you manage it and how you work with it. And I think it's really important that we kind of take a step back and we look at it that way. Because a lot of the times people are like, oh, well, with imposter syndrome, just don't feel that way. And that's just not... That's not super conducive, and it's not super helpful to how we deal with this as artists, because the reality is that you're never not going to feel that way. It comes and goes. It's everywhere. So finding better tools to deal with it is what's more important. Because again, like, I feel it all the time. It's okay to feel it. You know, I don't know. I question myself every day if I belong making videos on YouTube, stuff like that. Like that feeling never goes away. So the reality is that, you know, if I can get past that, you can do the same. No matter what level you're at, no matter where you're at. And the reality is that if you find communities that you want to be a part of, and maybe you feel like an imposter in those communities, take a step back. Figure out if it's the community that makes you feel that way, or if it's the feeling that you've just kind of developed for yourself. Because most of the time as artists, it's a feeling we develop ourselves. If the community is making you feel that way, by the way, leave that community. There's no need to be there for that. I've had so many horror stories over the years of people telling me that they've joined 3D communities and they got nothing but judgment and nothing but kind of being torn apart. And like, that's not cool. That's not what this is all about. So if you do have those feelings about a community and it's because of the community, you know, obviously leave that community. But the reality is that most times when you join a community, if you do have those feelings, they're probably self-generated. And that's okay. Have the feeling, work through it, figure out why you're feeling that way, and then go on. Move on. It's okay. Criticism and judgment are some of the hardest things that we face as artists and creators on the internet because it is plentiful. The internet is filled with people who just want to tear you down and tear you apart. And so I wanted to make this video to kind of help people understand, like, 9 times out of 10, it's completely made up. It's in our mind. If it's not, you can figure out how you deal with that situation, however you want to deal with that situation. Whether it's blocking the individual, removing the comment, that's fine. We can figure out how to work through those. It's the personal stuff that we think and we make up in our mind that kind of lock us down that we need to figure out how to work through. So when it comes to feeling like an imposter, just always remember, you're not an imposter. You belong in that space. Whether you're brand new or you're seasoned, you belong there. Especially if you just got a job and they hired you. You belong there. They wouldn't have hired you if you didn't belong there. So you belong there. Just try to make sure that you can quantify your feelings around those ideas and those concepts, and I promise you'll do fine. But for me, I think that's kind of the end of this video. I just kind of wanted to get a spew of thoughts out because it's something that I deal with on the daily, and I get a lot of questions about it because the reality is that we all deal with it. And so artists are very confused sometimes on how to deal with this. And on top of my normal 3D content, I like doing stuff like this because it gives me a break, lets me talk, and just kind of enjoy engaging with the community in a different way. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it a little bit helpful. If you have other ideas or concepts that you like to follow when you're dealing with your imposter syndrome, leave them down in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if you haven't yet, please make sure you like and subscribe because the channel is growing and we're growing at a rapid pace and it's kind of awesome. But there's plenty of learning content here. There's more to come and I'm really excited to see what happens. So again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked it and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you.